There are plenty of rare animals that we've all heard of, but there are also plenty of other, lesser-known species that are hardly ever talked about. This is particularly sad because it's often the species that the public doesn't know about that don't have enough conservation efforts put towards saving them. In this video, we're looking at 10 lesser-known, extremely rare species. Welcome back to All About Nature. On my channel, I try to bring nature-related content that's both educational and entertaining. If you like this kind of content, then please consider liking the video, leaving a comment, or even subscribing to the channel. I really appreciate your support. Australia has quite a few species of marsupial that are known and loved the world over, one of which is the wombat. But what many don't know is that wombats are not just one species of marsupial, rather three: the common wombat, the southern hairy-nosed wombat, and the northern hairy-nosed wombat. Of the three, by far the rarest is the northern hairy-nosed wombat, which is listed as critically endangered. 100 years ago, the species could be found across New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland. But as the population of Australia grew in the early 20th century, much of the species range was converted for agricultural use. The wombats didn't just lose their habitat, but they were also regularly culled in order to protect farmers' crops. By the time the culling had stopped, wild dogs had become numerous and regularly preyed on the northern hairy-nosed wombats. By the 21st century, the species had become restricted to an area of about 300 hectares in the Epping National Forest in Queensland, and their population was only at about 100 animals. But wild dogs were still regularly killing them. Park officials set up a predator-proof fence in an effort to protect the species, but having all of the animals in only one spot was a huge risk. One major disease or natural disaster was all it would take to wipe them out. So a secondary population was established in Richard Underwood Nature Refuge in 2008. Conservation efforts have been extensive. Volunteers monitor the fences and the area surrounding the parks. Invasive species like African bufflegrass are being removed to allow the wombats easier access to the native species that they prefer. And genetic research is being done to combat gender disparity in the population, as more than 2/3 of the wombats are male, and scientists still don't know why. In 1876 and 1877, a bird was collected 3 times from the western slopes of the Andes Mountains in northern Peru. It was a new species of Guan and had black feathers with green iridescence, a purple patch of skin around the eyes, and a deep orange dewlap. On the forewings, the primary feathers were white, leading to it receiving the common name of white-winged Guan. After the initial 3 specimens were collected, it was lost, and scientists wouldn't get a chance to see another one for 100 years. In 1969, rumors that the bird still survived further south from where the original specimens were seen began to surface. Peruvian ornithologist Gustavo del Solar heard from local farmers that the birds persisted deep in the brush of some remote ravines, and though it was incredibly rare, they were certain that they had spotted it. Del Solar spent 8 years following up on every rumored sighting. Then, in 1977, a farmer came to him certain that he had seen one hours out into the bush. Del Solar decided to trek out with the farmer. After the hours of trekking, Del Solar heard the calls of a bird that he hadn't heard before. And then he saw it. As the Guan flew away, the distinctive white marks on the wings were clearly visible. It turned out that the farmer was right. The species was rediscovered exactly 100 years after the last specimen had been collected. Del Solar managed to film the bird in its natural habitat, as well as capture a live bird for study. It turns out that the species only lives in a very specific habitat: small forested ravines between 500 and 1,100 meters in elevation. Their current habitat is restricted to only a thin strip of forest in northwestern Peru that's about 190 kilometers long and 40 kilometers wide. Today, their habitat is under threat, with human settlements becoming more common in the region and a major road having been constructed straight through it. But thankfully, their population seems to be stable. There are an estimated 200 white-winged guans left in Peru today. They were only known from 6 sites a few decades ago, but captive breeding and reintroduction efforts have successfully brought them back to 4 new sites. In 2018, they were downlisted from critically endangered to endangered, but they remain threatened by habitat destruction and hunting, and their population still sits at only around 200. Rabbits are common in many parts of the world. In some places, they've been introduced, becoming serious pests to local wildlife. But there are 13 known wild species of rabbit, several of which are extremely rare, including the Sumatran striped rabbit. They only live on the Indonesian island of Sumatra, where they're believed to primarily inhabit the Barisan Mountains in the southwest. But at least one confirmed sighting from the northwest has occurred, giving hope that the species might be more widespread than once thought. The Sumatran striped rabbit was described in 1880, but it's so rare it has hardly had any observations over the past 150 years. In fact, most local people have no idea that it even exists. Local languages have no name for it, instead borrowing words for rabbit from other languages. After a Sumatran striped rabbit was spotted in 1972, the species wasn't seen again for 28 years. In 2000, a sighting in Bukit Barisan Selatan National Park led to the rabbit being photographed for the first time. Since then, it's only had a handful of sightings, being caught on camera traps or seen by scientists. The most recent sighting was on Facebook, when a farmer caught one after a flash flood and then tried to sell it on the social media site. Thankfully, the authorities were notified, the rabbit was confiscated, and it was eventually released back into the wild. Because of its rarity, almost nothing is known about their ecology, and no estimates of population size exist. Their habitat is regularly under threat from deforestation, and the risk of being hunted by local people is high. The Sumatran striped rabbit is assessed as data deficient, though scientists assume that it's most likely critically endangered. On the Hawaiian Islands is a genus of plants known as the Cyanea. The genus includes 80 species, most of which have extremely limited ranges. 90% of them occur only on a single island, with many even being restricted to the slopes of a single volcano. In June of 2010, Hank Oppenheimer and Jennifer Hagashino were surveying plants near the summit of Helu Peak on the island of Maui. As they looked along the slopes with their binoculars to see what plants were growing there, they spotted a species of Cyanea that neither of them immediately recognized. So they carefully made their way down the slope and were surprised to find what they believed to be a new species of Cyanea. The leaves were distinctly narrow and lobed with irregular margins. They returned several times to make further observations. When they saw that it had white flowers and produced orange fruit, they knew it was a new species. Despite this, it wasn't formally described until 10 years later in 2020. This is because they needed to obtain a mature fruit to confirm that it was in fact distinct. Despite many visits over the years and several attempts at pest control in the vicinity, the seeds and new growth were all being eaten and destroyed by invasive rats and introduced slug species before reaching maturity. It wasn't until 2018 that a single cutting was successfully collected and rooted in the lab. The same year, they managed to also germinate a single mature fruit, and the species was described the following year as Cyanea heluensis. Still, only the one wild specimen is known to exist, and the Olinda Rare Plant Facility has the two other known specimens, one grown from the cutting and the one grown from the germinated seed. Without a lot more work being done to stop invasive species in Hawaii, Cyanea heluensis may never recover, along with countless other endemic species to the Hawaiian Islands. Off the coast of South Africa, the variety of ecosystems draw divers to a unique diving experience. Tropical reefs, temperate kelp forests, sardine runs, and massive sharks make it one of the most diverse spots to scuba dive in the world. In 1984, Peter Crystal was diving in shallow water on Alawal Shoal, a rocky reef about 5 kilometers off the east coast of the country, when he saw a species of ray that he hadn't seen before. It was dark brown with a series of yellow spots around the outer edge, along the tail, and down the center of the dorsal side. It also had a series of darker, elongated spots, adding to its beauty. He managed to capture a photo of it, but when he tried to capture the ray itself, it got away. The next time the species was recorded was 13 years later, in 1997, about 80 kilometers south of Alawal Shoal, just off of Shelley Beach. This time it was recorded by 2 producers of a nature documentary. The footage was sent to an ichthyologist, Phil Heemstra, who examined the footage and felt confident that it was a new species. But a specimen was needed in order to describe it. Heemstra himself went looking for it, and managed to find one 4 years later in 2001. But again, it eluded capture. Finally, in 2003, a live specimen was collected by a man named Mark Addison. Shortly thereafter, his father, Brent Addison, managed to capture a second specimen. After these 2 rays were closely examined, it was finally described as a new species in 2007, and the Ornate Sleeper Ray was named the #1 new species of the year by the International Institute for Species Exploration. Because of how rare the Ornate Sleeper Ray is, almost nothing is known about it, so a formal assessment of the population cannot be done. It's assumed to be critically endangered, with pollution and habitat degradation likely being the main threats to the species. Often, new species that are being described aren't being discovered in the field. With years of backlogged specimens waiting to be identified in understaffed museum collections, new species are often described from specimens that have been sitting in drawers for decades, sometimes even over a century. In the 2010s, a biologist named Christian Roos was examining species of langur in a museum collection when he came across a specimen of what he initially thought was a Fair's langur. But he noticed that the specimen was collected from Mount Popa, Myanmar, much further east than Fair's langurs were known to inhabit. The wild population was eventually found, with about 100 langurs still living on the slopes of Mount Popa, and a further 100 to 150 living in the surrounding forests. The museum specimen and the wild specimens were studied and compared to specimens of Fair's langur, and it was found that they differed in their skins, their skulls, and their coloration. In 2020, the Popa Langur was described as a new species and immediately listed as critically endangered. But today, it's nearly impossible to study the species in the wild. A civil war in Myanmar has made foreign entry extremely unsafe, and few Burmese scientists are able to perform field studies while the war rages. As a result, the current status of the species remains unknown. It's believed that the population is likely declining as a result of habitat loss and fragmentation because of the war. The relationship between species is often very complex, and the relationship between the Hirola and other species within its range has made its decline difficult to resolve. Hirola are a species of hartebeest that today is found only in a small area of land in northeastern Kenya, close to the Somali border, though evidence shows that they once ranged from Ethiopia all the way down to South Africa. These large antelope are sandy brown overall with lighter underparts, and they have white markings around their eyes and across the forehead that make them look like they're wearing a pair of spectacles. Hirola are often spotted around watering holes, where they prefer to graze on the short green grass that grows there. But they're almost never observed actually drinking water. In fact, it's believed that they can live in areas that are completely devoid of groundwater, surviving off the water that they get from their diet. But there's a problem. Short green grass has become hard to come by within their tiny range. There was once an abundance of elephants that the Hirola shared their range with. But in the 90s, elephants were eradicated from Somalia and northeastern Kenya. Without these massive herbivores present to clear woody trees and create open grasslands, the forest began to choke out the grasses that the hartebeests relied on. As a result, the Hirola began to move into unnatural areas in search of the food that they needed. While they preferred to avoid cattle, the species was forced to move into agricultural areas to get enough to eat. But this presented a new problem. Cattle carry a form of tuberculosis that can be highly contagious among cloven-foot animals. As a result, cases of cattle tuberculosis spread into the Hirola population and had a seriously negative impact on their numbers. And to make matters worse, drought, poaching, and competition with other more numerous species have all contributed to their decline. Conservationists have attempted to establish new populations in other protected areas of Kenya, but with little success. In the 1970s, there were an estimated 15,000 Hirola across their range, but today there are at most 500 remaining in the wild, with no captive populations existing anywhere in the world. The species continues to decline, and they may soon represent the first extinction of a mammalian genus on the mainland of Africa in modern human history. Handfish are strange animals endemic to the waters around Australia. 14 of the 17 known species prefer to live in the cold waters of Tasmania, Australia's southernmost state. These fish are strange because instead of swimming through the water like other fish, they walk along the seafloor on specially adapted fins that look like strange little feet. The red handfish, which is only known to inhabit the waters of Frederick Henry Bay off the south coast of Tasmania, is generally red with shades of pink, tan, and orange. Their Latin name means polished warty growths fish. The species relies on the rocky areas on the edges of the reef. Here, there's an abundance of algae that they can blend in with. Unfortunately, these habitats are quite rare, and the species is slow to reproduce. They also require seaweed to lay their eggs in. But as the waters around Tasmania warm, the native purple sea urchins have drastically increased in numbers and density. The sea urchins eat algae and seaweed, and have consumed most of the plants that the red handfish need for camouflage and reproduction. A small captive population is kept at Tasmania's Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies. In 2021, their captive fish managed to spawn and produce offspring. Again, in 2023, they spawned, this time producing 21 babies. Unfortunately, in the wild, they haven't been seeing the same success. Their numbers sit at somewhere between 50 and 100 mature fish. And with the continued warming of the oceans, in the near future, there may not be a space left for them to survive. There are a dozen species of civet found throughout Africa, southern Europe, South and Southeast Asia. Civets are slender mammals that are mostly nocturnal. While sometimes called civet cats, they're actually not felines at all, being more closely related to mongoose. The Malabar large-spotted civet was once abundant along the Malabar coast of southwestern India, where it was scientifically described in the 1860s. They're larger than other local species, and they have an overall dusky gray color with dark spots and stripes. Being nocturnal, they were difficult to observe in the wild, and by the time portable electric lighting was widely available, the species was already thought to be extinct. The Malabar large-spotted civet relies on dense forests to hide during the day, but in the first half of the 20th century, much of the forests were cleared for human development. By the 1960s, sightings had dried up, and they were assumed to have gone extinct. But in 1987, a single animal was spotted in Kerala. It's believed that the species was holding on in the cashew and rubber plantations of the area, as the farmers didn't clear the dense underbrush. This provided a space for the species to hide during the day. But in the 1990s, farming practices changed, and the underbrush of the plantations was cleared. Since then, no confirmed sightings of the species have taken place, and extensive attempts to capture the civets on camera traps in 2006 and 2007 failed to provide any evidence of their ongoing existence. At the beginning of the lockdown in 2020, this video, apparently filmed in Kerala, was uploaded to Twitter, claiming to show a Malabar civet wandering the streets. It went viral, but it didn't take long for researchers to discredit the claim that the animal in the video was a Malabar civet. It turned out that it was actually the similarly colored small Indian civet. No sighting of the Malabar large-spotted civet has been confirmed since 1987, but there might be more to the story. There's little to no background information about the species, and with the area historically being a major center for international trade, some scientists believe that the species may have just been a different species of civet, the large spotted civet from Southeast Asia. Scientists believe that the species may have been traded into the region, as its scent glands were used for medicine and to produce aromatics. It was then introduced, establishing a feral population that was eventually eradicated. If this is the case, then the species still persists in Southeast Asia, though it is classified as endangered there. Currently, the IUCN still classifies the Malabar large-spotted civet as a valid species, and it's listed as being critically endangered. In 1968, a scientist named J.P. Adam, who was researching bats in the Republic of the Congo, entered Kimanika Cave in the Koalu Department near the coast of the country. He was curious to see what species he might come across, but as he entered, he discovered some bats he had never seen before. The species' forearm measured nearly 5 centimeters, and it had long ears and a large leaf nose. He took some photos and collected 10 specimens to use as a syntype to describe the new species, which was eventually named after him, Adam's horseshoe bat. After being described, the area that the species was found in has remained in stable condition. Other species of bats found in the region have also maintained stable populations. But for some reason, Adam's horseshoe bat has never been observed since. As a result, the species cannot be assessed and is categorized as missing, as data on the bats remains deficient. We also know almost nothing about it. It's assumed that the species must persist, and if it does, its population is likely very small. And that's it for today's video. Had you heard of any of these species before? Let me know in the comments. I also need to say a special thanks to my patrons. Without their ongoing support, I wouldn't be able to produce a video like this every week. If you want to join us on Patreon, hit the link in the video description below. And if you want to watch any of my other videos on the topic of extremely rare species, click the playlist on the screen now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.